Okay, I think we will start. Maybe people will join while we are starting. I know that it's been a very long day. So it's my pleasure to welcome you today at this special session of the Kurgan van Entenrijk Chair in Business History. The chair was this year embedded in the European Society History for Urban Society for the History of Science Conference, as you know, and the chair was launched in 2015 and with the generous support of Stéphane Kurgan as a means to promote the academic discipline of business history, which is one of the sister discipline, of course, of many historical disciplines, among which history of science. A discipline for which Stéphane's mother, Jeanette Kurgan van Entenrijk, who's dear today, has played a pivotal role in Belgium and beyond. The chair aims at spreading research in the field of business history with a special emphasis on the history of the knowledge economy. Through annual conferences, the chair brings together opinion makers from the international academic world, politics, finance, and business and society as a whole around themes of general interest. And this year's topic is dedicated to the issue of health policy and the politics of vaccines. And some time ago, we decided in the scientific committee to tackle really this burning question through two different perspectives. My estimated colleague, economist Mathias Dewatripont, professor at ULB, will introduce you later to our second speaker, Reinhilde Veugelers. Thank you, Mathias. Myself now, I'm very happy to introduce you our first speaker, Victor Rodwin, Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Robert Wagner School of Public Service, New York University. He's also co-director of the World Cities Project, a joint venture of Wagner, NYU, Hastings Center, and the Butler Columbia Aging Center. His research on comparative international healthcare system reforms and health policies has resulted in numerous publications. He's also frequently quoted for his work on world cities and urban planning. So, I'm very happy, really, because Victor has made a long journey to come to Brussels. I'm very, very grateful for his presence today here. And I will directly lead him to the floor. Please, Victor, come here. Thank you so much. I will quit the conference.
Thank you, Kenneth, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Mathias, for sharing this event. I'm going to watch my watch attentively since we have very limited time, which is always a good thing. It forces the speaker to make the most important points.
You can either
as quickly as possible
with the remote or directly and with the arrow.
As you wish. Direct.
Okay, perfect.
I think.
Thank you.
Wow. The first time in my life that I'm speaking to a group of historians. So it's always interesting to see how different specialists will react. But it's not the first time in my life that I'm speaking on this theme. It was a challenging theme that Kenneth gave me. He said, just give a talk about European health systems in the United States. And of course, I could spend hours asking, what is Europe? Is it 27 countries? Is it 12 countries? Is it, but I won't even go there. And I could spend equal amounts of time saying, what is the United States, particularly today, when many suggest that we're on the verge of civil war and defederalization, which may bring us closer to the European community in our structures. But that too, I will put aside. It's easy also to imagine in my field caricatures of health systems abroad as something we wish either to adopt at home or something we wish to avoid at home. That's typically the way we speak about health systems. National Health Service, socialized medicine, un-American, impossible. Switzerland, private health system, wonderful. The United States, privatization, terrible. We need social insurance. I mean, and they're all caricatures and they have nothing to do or very little to do with the actual structures and financing and delivery across a variety of systems each of which claims to be exceptional and is in certain ways, although no claim is stronger than that of American exceptionalism, which I shall return to at the end of this discussion. So I thought the way to deal with this is to start with what we have in common across the Atlantic and here in Europe. But then at the last minute, just before leaving, I thought, my God, I'm talking to historians. I have to say something about history. And I've just finished reading an American Nobel laureate, William Faulkner, who has a great deal to say about history. And there was a wonderful interview with him that I will read you just as an introduction. Mr. Faulkner in Absalom, Absalom, that's the novel. Does any one of the people who talks about Sutton have the right view? Or is it more or less a case of 13 ways of looking at a blackbird with none of them right? And Faulkner responds in the following way. That's it, exactly. I think that no one individual can look at truth. It blinds you. You look at it and you see one phase of it. Someone else looks at it and sees a slightly awry phase of it. But taken all together, the truth is in what they saw, though nobody saw the truth intact. It was, as you say, 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. But the truth, I would like to think, comes out that when the reader has read all these 13 different ways of looking at the blackbird, the reader has his own 14th image of that blackbird, which I would like to think is the truth. I think there's something profound in Faulkner and in that vision of history. And I think it applies beyond history to much of social science, in spite of the fact that social scientists, mostly, I suspect, would resist. But I won't get into that either. Let me go straight to proposing some convergent trends. And here I'm going to give you a kind of a caricature. If we take the US as something which is actually the same, which it's not, and if we take Europe, which is also a set of countries which are the same, which it's not, let's make along 4 criteria. Is that not long enough? Let's put along 4 criteria the basic differences on coverage, on financing, on healthcare prices, and on healthcare expenditure and health status. And most of this you probably know, but just a review. On coverage, the United States has extensive coverage. It does not have no coverage, as some people think. On financing, on Europe, there is generally universal coverage, more or less, much more than less. On financing in the United States, it's actually half public, half private. Often in Europe, people think it's all private. Wrong. Financing in Europe is mostly public through a combination of taxes and compulsory social social insurance. On healthcare prices, and our specialists in pharmaceuticals know this very well, we have the highest prices in the world. The same applies to all of healthcare. Nurse salaries, physician salaries, hospital prices, pharmaceutical prices, outpatient care prices are the highest in the world, generally speaking. In Europe, prices tend to be regulated. In terms of expenditures, we have the highest expenditure per capita in the world. In terms of the percent of population uninsured, we have a 10% still, even after the Obama reforms, who are uninsured. And we have an even larger percent who are what we call underinsured and not very good insurance, which leads to very high health debt. And then in terms of health status, categorically, we have the worst health status of the wealthy nations of the world. There's no disputing on any indicator, not any, but almost all the critical indicators, including life expectancy, which incidentally is decreasing by 2 years over the last period in the United States, something we haven't had since the Great Depression. There's a historical footnote. So this is the caricature of our systems. Now, the convergent trends across Europe and the United States, and this is what I would like to call attention to, is that the healthcare sector, by which I mean hospitals, pharmacy, outpatient care, and public health, has been increasing enormously in all of our countries. The increasing role of markets, both in Europe and in the United States, in the allocation of resources in health is an important trend since World War II. On the demand side, we have population aging, the epidemiological transition, which means the transfer from infectious disease to chronic disease. And in spite of our recent COVID, which is not really which is an infectious disease, that aside, which is an important exception, the chronic disease is associated with old age, and that's the challenge of the future for healthcare. On the supply side, technology and innovation, extraordinarily important in healthcare. I don't need to explain that, whether it's pharmacy, whether it's hospital, whether it's even management. The innovation is very important. Other than growth, what's really interesting, looking back since World War II, is what I would call health sector transformation. The increasing role of patient engagement, something we never saw 30 years ago. The increasing role of information, like everywhere else in our society, has enormous implications in healthcare. And finally, more so in the United States than in Europe, but also in Europe, the increasing role of what one economist would call supply side integration. That is to say that we begin to talk about healthcare not just as an isolated hospital, an isolated doctor office, a separate silo for public health, but an integrated system containing the hospital, the doctor, the insurance, the public health, the prevention and promotion, and the long-term care, all in one system which combines it all. Now, I don't have time to go into detail, but I can flip through the slides and you can imagine what this lecture would be if I had an hour, but I won't do it. And that is, in terms of growth, just for the United States, but the same thing applies to Europe. We go from 1975 to 2020 to 4 million jobs in healthcare to 22 million jobs in healthcare, from $550 per capita spending to $12,000 per capita spending, through a typical office visit of 60 minutes for a new patient and a return patient of 30 minutes to 12 minutes and 7 minutes, from 8% of GDP to almost 20% of GDP today, especially with COVID, if you include that. To a system which was relatively simple, to a system with so many acronyms that nobody understands anything. DRGs, RVUs, EHRs, PBMs, ACOs. It would take a whole semester, which is how I make my living, to explain some of these things. And it accounts for the growth of the whole field that I'm in, called health policy and management. Now, if I were to review, again, very, very quickly, the transformation, both in Europe and in the United States, but probably more so than in the United States than Europe. Rudolf Klein, political scientist in England, I'll put this table together and I love it. He says, healthcare has changed from a model oriented, it resembles mostly the church and replaces it, to a model that is much more like a garage. That is to say, we move from a system of paternalism to a system of consumerism, a system where you had planning for healthcare to a system where you respond to demand, a system where one talked about need and what patients need to a system where you talk about what patients choose, a system where planners, and I did my early work on planning, talked about priorities, to a system where we talk about contracts, a system where healthcare was universalistic to a system where it becomes pluralistic, and a system which was basically stable to one which is much more focused on adaptability, although I will end my talk by suggesting, at least in the United States, that there is an extraordinary stability, in spite of the call for reform. And now I will go even faster, because I think I have 10 minutes. And go into some more detail with things you're familiar with. but just a picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes. The demographic pyramid, for those who believe that demography is destiny, shifts its shape from being a pyramid with fewer older people on top to becoming a rectangle with a lot more people on top. And the demographers talk about this as the rectangularization of the pyramid. And that force of change is operative both in the United States and in Europe, and has changed the whole demand side of what health systems must now respond to. An aging population with chronic disease is not treated the same way as a population 40 years ago without that chronic disease. It requires a totally different health system, and we've not adapted it to this change on demand. So for those who believe that demography is destiny, this indicates how the healthcare systems will change in both countries. Again, this is our convergent approach. For those who believe that demography is not destiny, that Malthus was wrong, and that what's really important in driving the future, then you look to technology. I think people in business look to technology. They look to technology, they look to innovation, they look to private capital and its impact and importance in funding this kind of innovation. And I don't have to persuade this group, even with an old slide from 2015, that the world population increases from between 2010 and 2020 from 6.8 to 7.6. The connected devices, and these facts were projections when they were written, but they're quite accurate. I've just checked them. From 12.5 billion devices to 50 billion devices. Number of smartphone subscriptions goes up, number of wireless hotspots goes up, number of transistors goes up, number of sensors go up. Sensors are critical in healthcare. Changes everything. Which has led a distinguished French urologist that I know well, Guy Valencien, based in Paris, to write this book called La médecine sans médecin. And that's a really interesting topic to discuss. What medicine will be like without doctors, and how technology can replace and already is replacing doctors. And I could show you, if I had time, a quick video of Taito Care and how a patient goes into a little cabin, meets the doctor, and the doctor gives a quick diagnosis based on a conversation and based on sensors. And that's not just a vision of the future, that's happening today in Europe and in the United States. So again, a point of conversion. It used to be the doctor will see you now. This is turned on its head, and we have systems around Europe and the United States where it's the patient will see you now. The patient clicks and calls into a doctor who is on call for the patient at whatever time the patient requests to see the doctor. This is the work of Eric Topol, based in the United States in La Jolla, near San Diego, where they claim to be innovative. Telehealth, very, very important. You've all experienced it. I won't go into it. The second part of my talk, perhaps the most important, and I hope I have a few minutes, is that in spite of this convergence, there is also, and this I'd say for discussion with you, I think important divergence across Europe and the United States. And the key differences would be structural differences in the health system between Europe and the United States, which I could speak about. The extent of healthcare expenditure and prices, which I've already mentioned, which will remain, I think, quite different, and which distinguish Europe from the United States. That is, higher prices, higher expenditure in the United States than in Europe. The fact that in the United States, healthcare is big business. It has been for some time, and it's getting more and more so. And although that's a slightly convergent trend in Europe, it's not nearly of the magnitude that we have in the United States, and I don't think it will be. But again, that goes beyond history to futurism. The fourth point of divergence is what I would call supply side consolidation. There has been some in Europe, but it's very small compared to the supply side consolidation that one finds in the United States, with large hospitals emerging as horizontally integrated institutions, to the move to vertically integrated institutions, the growth of managed care, which would also be a separate lecture, but is a critical aspect of the American system that barely exists in Europe. I mean, to the extent that it exists in Europe, it's what I would call soft managed care, or decorative managed care, or managed care in name to follow a trend, but it's not hard managed care of the kind that takes insurance and funding and reintegrates the entire organization so that doctors become, just as Paul Starr, the historian, predicted about 40 years ago, small peons of corporate medicine, which we find increasingly happening in the United States. So although the fear in the United States was always a government takeover of care à la européenne, the real thing that's happening is a corporatization of care through the private sector, because the government is far, far, far from taking over anything in the United States except beginning to regulate prices in a very soft kind of way. That's the summary of the second part. And I have 5 minutes. Okay. To go into the detail of divergence, you just look at this table and you see that in 1980, healthcare costs per capita were higher in the United States than any of these other European countries. And it only is exacerbated over time so that the gap between that increases because the rate of increase of healthcare expenditures adjusted for inflation has been higher over the last 40 years in the United States than in Europe. So the gap is bigger than ever. And that's a point of divergence, which I don't think will change easily. Medical prices along a whole set of issues, hip replacement, knee replacement, normal delivery, C-section, angioplasty, are higher in the United States. Those are the red dots than all of the other dots in mostly European countries. I included because I had the data, Australia and New Zealand, but this would apply to most European countries, even Switzerland. Amazon, you all know Amazon, is attempting to take over healthcare. They've not succeeded. It's very hard. It won't happen overnight, but they are already building healthcare systems for their own employees and testing out the extent to which they can use their infrastructure to make a dent in healthcare. I'm not predicting a takeover by Amazon in the United States at all, but I am suggesting that this is an example of big business in healthcare in a way that diverges from what you're likely to see in Europe, even if you'll see some of this at the margin, perhaps. This is all for discussion. The retail clinics in the United States have spread all over. If you go to Manhattan, and many who travel to New York, you can see in every block now little minute MDs, where you don't have a primary care doctor, you just go in, they don't have your records, they quickly make a record, they take care of you in a pretty effective way, but there's no coordination of care, no continuity of care, and it's all run by private for-profit corporations, for the most part, not only. It has changed the whole landscape of outpatient care in the United States. If you just imagine CVS, which has drugstores all over the United States, they only have about 1,200 clinics today, but they have 7,000 locations. So the possibilities with minimal investment of putting more clinics into more CVS stores is immense in Walgreens and in CVS, and could well continue. The annualized equity returns by sector are almost as high in healthcare as in big tech. And with the lowering of big tech, healthcare continues to go up there, although everything's a little lower now. But the equity over the last 10, 20 years has been very, very strong in healthcare, which is an indicator, I believe, of healthcare as big business and healthcare as private investor owned. The Schumpeter, whom the economists have all read, talked about creative destruction under capitalism. It's really operative in healthcare in the United States. It's an extraordinary case study of creative destruction, where old structures are demolished and new structures arrive, where the gemütlich vision of a doctor operating in a private solo-based office billing fee for service is gemütlich. It's a thing of the past. It's romantic. It's cute. And you'll find many older doctors talk with great nostalgia about how that is eroding. But in fact, hospitals are buying up the practices, putting doctors on salaries, And if it's not hospitals, it's insurance companies. And so this is another example of integration, big business. The medical industrial complex, do I have 4 more minutes or 3? 3, okay. Then Elizabeth Rosenthal's book has to go to you in American sickness, healthcare, how healthcare became big business. Lobbying in healthcare is among the highest expenses in lobbying, even higher than financial and real estate. Thank you. Outpatient visits have increased over the last 30 years. Inpatient admissions have decreased. The percentage of primary care doctors working in organizations outside of those offices has decreased. That's the solo practice line. And what we have, in contrast to Europe, is a fragmented system with fragmented payers. And I don't really have the time to go into how it works because I don't want to abuse my time. But we could talk about the ways that the US health system continues to diverge, not just from Europe, but from the rest of the world, and what that means. But I'd rather leave that for a discussion of US exceptionalism and its historical roots and what may explain it than go into it now. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Victor, for this fascinating talk. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, but we agreed with Kenneth that we will group the questions in the interest of time because we have quite a hard time constraint at 7:30. And so first, Reinhilde will do her presentation. So I'm very happy to introduce her. Reinhilde is a full professor at the KU Leuven at the Department of Management, Strategy and Innovation. She's a prolific and prominent researcher, heavily cited work on various topics from internal R&D versus external acquisition, R&D spillovers across fields and sectors, academic technology transfer offices, or the definition and characterization of novelty in science. She has published in top economics and management journal, from Management Science to the American Economic Review, many in research policy. And she has published also in Science and Nature. This has led to multiple academic distinction, from a member of the Royal Flemish Academy of Belgium for Sciences, Academia Europeana, and others. She's also had prominent academic responsibilities. She's currently a member of the board of reviewing editors of the journal Science and a co-principal investigator on the Science of Science funding initiative of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the premier academic economist network in the world, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She also served on the Scientific Council of the ERC, European Research Council, from 2012 and 2018. She also has quite some influence in economic policy, having been a senior fellow at Bruegel, the premier economics think tank in Europe, since 2009. And so I'm very excited to introduce her to present her all-important work on the all-important mRNA history, whose BioNTech, Pfizer, and Moderna vaccines are so influential in containing, for now at least, the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that builds on her Bruegel paper, which has a provocative title, mRNA Vaccines, a Lucky Shot, interrogation mark, documenting in this case what one usually calls the non-linearity of the science and innovation process, or to paraphrase the French saying about life, la vie n'est pas un long fleuve tranquille. Science indeed is not a quiet river. Up to you, Reinhilde.
Does it work? Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mathias. This very nice introduction, particularly coming from the top economist in Belgium, is really very appreciated. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you because as I'm studying the economics of science, the history of science comes really close here. So I'm very much keen also in learning your perspectives on this. And the story that I want to tell is on the mRNA story, which is ongoing history. It's not really old history, but still, I think an interesting story for which we can definitely also learn in terms of what improvements we could make in future or not. So the reason why I picked the mRNA, why the mRNA story for vaccines was so interesting, because it's really an example of a new technology, a completely disruptive, Schumpeter's creative destruction story going on in the vaccines market here. And the question I really want to address is our system that we have in terms of the whole health innovation ecosystem, going from science to innovation to production to healthcare provision, is that whole ecosystem sufficiently resilient and robust and receptive for completely new technologies that are disrupting in incumbent positions here. So the mRNA vaccines is really a saga of a transformative technology and whether or not it was successful. Just to make the case that it is a really novel disruptive technology, if you compare it with the existing technologies for producing vaccines, the very old ones are using whole inactivated or attenuated viruses. This is, for instance, still for COVID, the example of the Chinese technology for producing Chinese vaccines. But then more recently, at the frontier of vaccine technology production was viral vectors and protein technology that's still using viruses, but only subunits of that, and also adding some adjuvant components to that. So it's already way more advanced than just wholly using viruses here. But the mRNA technology is completely different from that, because it's actually completely synthetic technology here. So it really uses different components that are, and then synthesizes these components that can be used as active drugs for incentivizing the right immune reactions here. So completely synthetic means that it can be actually very quickly designed once you have the whole DNA structure of the virus. And the virus is a very simple DNA structure. Once you have that, you can very easily identify which components you would need to address here, then synthesize them. And then also, because it's synthetic, also makes it that the production can be done quite quickly because it's purely synthetic, a purely chemical process, and can be scaled up very easy. And if you compare that with the incumbent technologies, you always had to produce existing viruses, which means really a lot of cell culture here where lots of stuff can actually go wrong. And so that's way more difficult to scale up. So this was a drastic new technology because it really was chemical rather than biological, and also because it was really this synthesizing process here. So completely different technologies, different ways of producing here. Nevertheless, now with the success of COVID, it's seen that this is really a technology that will not only be very groundbreaking for vaccines, but for medicine in general here, for any kind of other infectious disease, but even beyond infectious diseases like cancer, this mRNA technology has a lot of potential other applications. So basic question then that we want to address is this mRNA technology, it passed successfully the COVID test here? Were we actually, was this actually to be expected? Is this a normal process if you look at how much money we put into the system, how many people are working on the system, of course we get all these transformative technologies, or were we lucky? So does our overall biomedical innovation ecosystem and also our public policy support, does it encourage enough these breakthrough radical technologies here like mRNA? can we rely on the future that this will always occur, or should we actually, do we learn from the mRNA case to know how to do it even better in future? So let me very briefly, and I hope you signal me if I take too much time because there's lots to talk about. If you look at the mRNA story, and it starts all with the research for mRNA, well, actually, it's a very long story here. And this is very typical for research in any kind of innovation. It takes a long time here. The discovery of the mRNA in itself goes back to 1961 here. But what was really important was the way to learn how to synthesize mRNA. That was done in 1984, all in the US. But then, in order to be able to use mRNA for drugs, very important discovery followed in 1990, where people in the Salk Institute in California, they really found that proteins that were delivered by mRNA, that actually the body reacts to that and can create the proteins that this mRNA is actually delivering to them. And if that's the case, that means that indeed you can use mRNA to make the body to make the body produce the proteins that you need for the drugs here. So actually, it's the body itself that now becomes the drug producing machine here, thanks to mRNA. So that created a lot of possibilities. So with mRNA, you could actually use the human body for drug production. But of course, there was a very critical problem, and that critical problem was immune reaction here, because this is a synthetic, you synthesize, it's a foreign body, and the body will react to that by creating an immune response. And it's that problem that really held back a lot of research in mRNA, and researchers willing to go into the mRNA area, because everybody thought this immune response problem is too big to tackle here. However, there always are these stubborn researchers here, and in this case, there was Katalina Karikó. She was a young Hungarian biochemist. Remember, chemist is very important for synthetic mRNA, who immigrated to the US, and she really believed in the mRNA technology and really wanted to come up with a way of circumventing that immune reaction of the body. She worked very hard on that, asked for lots of grants funding in order to fund her research at NIH, but always got turned down because what she proposed was way too radical. She had no proof of concept, no preliminary results, and that's typically what you need in order to be successful in NIH grants, already to have some early results. She didn't have any of that. And in the end, actually also the University of Pennsylvania, where she was no longer willing to fund her because she couldn't bring in any grants here. And she had to really move to a very soft kind of postdoc position here. But nevertheless, she didn't give up. She stayed. Lots of researchers then leave to outside academia, but she stayed. And then came this photocopy machine moment. Very often there is this kind of moment, or it's a coffee machine moment here, where at the University of Pennsylvania, she met Drew Weissman at the photocopying machine. Drew Weissman was just arriving at the University of Pennsylvania. He was an immunologist who worked just returned from NIH, where he had worked with Fauci, by now also a very famous name. He was also very much interested in mRNA, but not so much in the applications that Katalina was looking at, was more for brain damages here. He was really interested in vaccines and using mRNA technology for vaccines. They started talking on the photocopying machine, and actually they said, come on, we have to work on this, let's try. But of course, they didn't have any funding. But Weissman, being already somewhat more established, he had other grants from other projects, not at all related to mRNA, that he actually somehow could use for funding Katalina Karikó. This is how they actually got going. And then came up, fortunately, their lucky finding here, where they really discovered what caused the immune reaction of the body. It was which protein was the uridine protein, and if they changed it to pseudouridine, they could evade the immune reaction of the body here. So that was the really big discovery. They really had problems getting it published in top journals like Science. They got it published eventually in Immunity, which is a good journal, but a top field journal, not a general journal. Initially didn't get many citations because the whole field was really very reluctant for this breakthrough here. So it took some time, but by now, of course, everybody recognizes this to be really a breakthrough here, and they are highly cited and even quoted to be potential Nobel Prize winners here. But immediately after, it was still very difficult to get that recognition. Even Carico didn't get any other funding after her breakthrough result here. So it was really not an easy story in terms of research. That's where the research was. But then the next thing is, how can we now go to the development of mRNA and really using it for drugs and particularly for vaccines? The University of Pennsylvania owns the property rights. So Catalina Carico and Weissman had to disclose to the university. The university took the patent on this, but wasn't actually really interested in this, and gave actually transferred the patent to a company, CellScript, which could license the technology. Carico and Weissman set up their own startup for developing drugs and particularly vaccines based on mRNA, and they couldn't even license their own invention from CellScript here. So really also these initial stages of development really were not easy. In the end, the companies that did continue to work on the development were all very small startup companies. So it was not just Catalina Carico and Weissman because they quit, but there was BioNTech company in Germany, also Moderna, and also CureVac, a German small tech startup. All of these startups really came from researchers at universities that went to these startup companies here. So very close links to science. They were looking at applications in all kinds of areas here, but particularly in cancer, because that's a way more profitable business here. It's a much larger market than vaccines here. So those were the applications they were looking at. So when in January 2020, COVID broke out, there was actually no mRNA-based drug already close to market here. So that was a state of technology when COVID enters. So if you take that into account, it's really surprising that we got an mRNA-based vaccine for COVID in such a short time period here. I'm not going to talk about how much successful that was, the whole blockbuster saga. You can read that in many articles here, how successful they were in terms of how fast they could actually have a drug, a vaccine available here that could be put on the market here, but then also how successful they were to really produce at large scale. That was not CureVac. CureVac chose a technology that was different from the pseudouridine that Weissman and Carico and BioNTech had chosen here. They chose a different path and they were not as successful here. So again, that illustrates that it's really because of luck that they picked the right technology choice that really the success was eminent. Also, Moderna took that same pseudouridine and they were also more successful here. So if you take a look at who the firms were behind, then this success, those were, and it's not so surprising because remember, this is a complete new technology, breakthrough technology, completely different from the existing technologies here. These were all new players, young, small startups, science-based startups here. While the incumbent firms in the vaccine market, and there were really big players in the vaccine market here. These incumbents were GSK, Merck, Pfizer, and Sanofi. They each had almost 90%, together they had 90% of the market. So these are really the four big players. None of these four big players were actually actively developing mRNA technology for drugs here. They were keeping an eye on it though, but all thought that this was way too risky and too far from the market to be willing to invest massively into this here. So it was only these startup companies here. Is it then the startup companies themselves? Well, actually, if you look at the success behind, then of course it's not only these startup companies. They also needed to have a whole biomedical ecosystem behind them in order to be able to do this so fast and at a world scale, at such a large scale here. That's of course most evident if you look at BioNTech, because BioNTech partnered with Pfizer. Pfizer was one of the big incumbents here. Pfizer was willing to support still the research phase of BioNTech here, and so was funding the research and early development going on in BioNTech in return for also getting then shared access to the property rights here. And part of the agreement was also that they would be sharing all the revenues. But what's important is not only that Pfizer was bringing in the money for research, it was also their expertise in terms of production, which was quite important. Although it had to be retooled from the incumbent technologies to the chemical, they nevertheless had the capacity and the production capacity to retool here and also to distribute here. That was very important. The initial phases of production, that's something that BioNTech could have done at small scale still, but in order to scale up, it was really essential that Pfizer production facilities could be used here. So that was really a very powerful combination that really also explains why it's particularly this Pfizer-BioNTech, which is a big success story here. Moderna and also CureVac did it on their own. They did not go in partnership with other big pharma here, but that doesn't mean that they also needed other parts of the ecosystem here, particularly with respect to production. But there are also very specialized service providers in this that actually produce for others, like for instance the Swiss contract manufacturing firm Lonza, but also there are others, but not so many others. And fortunately, that Moderna could also use these production facilities, contract with them. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for them to really also produce at large scale here. So these small companies are really very important in order to bring the new technology to the market here, but they also cannot do it on their own. They really need the big, deep financial pockets, but also the manufacturing and distribution capacity at large scale here that they need to be able to use and to contract for here. So funds are very important here. Who funds not only the research and the development, but also the production stages here. If you look at the funding for the research, that's very typical. It's always public funding that goes into funding of science here. And if we take a look at the mRNA story, you do see how difficult it was actually to get funding for this high risk type of breakthrough research here. So Carrico and Weissman really had a hard time getting funding from NIH here, and even afterwards here. There was a bit of funding also at the EU side for, like, for instance, Sahin, founder of BioNTech, but that also from the ERC, he got funding, but that actually came way later here. So it was not the early phases, it was already when it had already progressed way further and was for cancer rather than for vaccines here. And this is in general an issue that I would love to talk about, but that will be a topic for other discussion here. That's really a very general phenomenon that we see here, is how the whole funding agencies, the public funding agencies, are typically avoiding or trying or have a bias against funding risky research here. That has to do with many things, like, for instance, relying very much on publications and measuring the quality of that with bibliometrics, which is really focused on short-term impact citations. And all these breakthroughs here, they usually, if they have impact, takes a way longer time here than you can pick up with bibliometrics. And another bias in the system is that it's very much discipline specific, these panels that evaluate here, and all these breakthroughs very often they cross the different disciplines here, like in the case of mRNAs, very much biochemical rather than the typical medical here. So a lot of persistency in the science funding system here that makes the system quite biased in terms of funding risky research. So that's already something we need to think about. Can we improve it in future to make sure we get that funding better organized. Then the next phase of who funds the vaccine development. Well, if you take it at the mRNA case here, you would think perhaps again a lot of public funding here, particularly as it's vaccines, but there was actually quite a lot of private funding, particularly in the early stages here. So there's a lot of angel funding for each of these small startups here, also VC funding, including corporate VC, including from big pharma here. So that's actually their way of, they don't go fully in, but they venture capital fund so that they can actually share the risk and monitor here without taking the full risk here. There was also a bit of public-private partnerships, particularly for vaccines with CEPI as another example that is relatively recent, where there is a combination of public and private in order to fund the early stages of vaccine development. And then there was, it's not to say that there was no public funding of that vaccine development here, but it was really in complement with the private funding, and particularly at somewhat later stages than the early stage. A very important public funder and still early stage in the US was DARPA. DARPA defense, but vaccines is related to defense here. So that's why they were interested in funding, not cancer, but vaccine mRNA technology for vaccines here. They were not interested in funding research. They're only interested in funding applications that works for them. So it was really develop an mRNA for a vaccine. That was what they were willing to fund. 3 minutes, okay. Yeah, they didn't spend much, but they spent it very early, and that really made a lot of difference here. And they did fund Moderna, and that really was critical information and funding also for Moderna that helped it also to recruit other funding later on here. Another very important public funding instrument for vaccines is the purchase of the vaccines here, because there is advanced purchase commitments. And if that's sufficiently advanced and at sufficiently high price, that also helps and to create an incentive and help the early development as well. And that's particularly was important in the US, because the US had this very big Operation Warp Speed setup, where they had really substantial advanced purchase and at high prices, relatively high prices. Compared to Europe, we also had joint purchase for the first time, but much smaller amounts here, with a smaller budget here and lower prices. We were very proud that we were able to do this at lower prices than the US, but in terms of incentivizing the development, that's another story here. So DARPA was really very important and successful for mRNA vaccines. I won't be able to have time to talk about DARPA here, but it's clear that it really played a pivotal role, particularly because it's much less has this bias against risk here. On the contrary, it really goes for all these areas where there is a lot of risk here, that it sees really as its area here. CEPI was also relatively new, also was successful in terms of funding a lot of vaccine developments here. Was a bit of funding, but actually they funded mostly the incumbent technologies here. They had mRNA in the portfolio, but actually relatively small here. So the future roadmap from mRNA vaccines. So now that we've seen the whole story of mRNA development here, can we say that, yes, of course, that was obvious that we had the mRNA technology for vaccines, or was there a lucky shot still here? It's up for discussion whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, I think. But still, in any case, I think that it was not an obvious story for development here. It was a difficult story, and I think we can at least try to do better and see whether we can make improvements here. We should at least be able to learn from the mRNA story here. And then I think there are, of course, two important components in terms of what we can do from a public policy perspective. One is to get our public R&D funding for these breakthroughs better here, and then particularly addressing that risk bias, both in terms of the science funding in our science agencies for the early stages, but also for the early stage development here. The DARPA example, could we also have that in Europe here, so that we also can stimulate these type of initiatives in Europe? And then, so that's the public R&D funding for science. I think really have to work on that, on those specific risky funding mechanisms here. But then what's also very important from a policy perspective is to get that private ecosystem that you typically need for development phases to make sure that that's sufficiently thick and able to really take on new players as well. And it's not just purely incumbent in players here, but that it's sufficiently contestable for new players, that new players with breakthrough ideas can really fall back on a very thick ecosystem of funders, of producers of their technology, contractors, so that actually every breakthrough idea can actually find enough partners in that ecosystem here for funding, for production, for other complementary assets that it needs, so that these breakthrough technologies, when they are successful, can really also make it to market here. So that was, in a nutshell, what I saw from the mRNA example here. I think it really gives us a lot of food of thought. Think of, can we really rely on our innovation policy support system here, what improvements we could actually make. I run very fast, but you can also look up these publications where it's a bit more elaborate here, but I'm now looking forward to the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. So thanks a lot, Reinhilde. Another fascinating speech. Thank you for joining us, Victor. So let me open the floor for questions. I'm sure there are many. We have, I think, 15 minutes. We have extended the time limit by 10 minutes. So I don't know who wants to start. And Kenneth, kindly move the microphone around.
Hello, my name is Nina Wolf, and I have actually two questions. Victor, I just want to say, from a village kid, welcome to Belgium, because I grew up in Greenwich Village, so I know you teach at NYU. I grew up on 12th Street, so you might recognize the accent. I wanted to ask you if, like, which side of the fence of the Obamacare you were on, because I didn't quite catch that. That was one question. And living here now in Brussels, and with a chronic disease of diabetes, I'm exposed to both. In America, I have Obamacare, and here I have what they call a mutuelle. And I just, you know, I've now been exposed to both. And so it's more of a commentary. And I think that the United States has come a long way with Obamacare. And then the other question I had was about the mRNA and whether research is being done and using that towards curing leukemia. Thank you, and thank you all.
Do you want to collect some question, Kenneth, or do we go?
Absolutely, yeah.
But otherwise, you can each answer already. Maybe first, second question.
A small side remark to the first talk. My name is Ernst Homburg. I'm from Maastricht University. You contrasted very well, of course, the American and the European system, but there is no real one European system. So in the Netherlands, we have a very strong position of the insurance companies, much stronger than in some other countries. So that is already the last 20 years, and they dictate a lot to the hospitals about what they can do, what type of medical care and not. So this is not really the American way, but it goes that direction.
Okay, first, Victor, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, so the mRNA technology, like I said, it's really a generic technology here, so it can be used. It is working, right? No? Oh, I hear myself. Yeah, So the mRNA technology is a very platform type of technology that can be used for many different diseases. Here, the synthesizing of the proteins. But of course, the more complicated the disease is, the more difficult it will be. Viruses are very easy, they're very simple structures. It's very easy to do this here. So there was an obvious first hanging fruit here, but there is a lot of research into other, in particular cancer is one, because it's such a huge market that if you're successful there, there's way more returns than for vaccines. So indeed, there is a lot, and because of the similar immunology reactions, it's very similar. So you can learn a lot from the vaccine development that can, and the success with the COVID, to bring that back to cancer here. So there's a lot of learning also in terms of how to produce that is now actually spilling back into cancer here.
I'm not sure I understood the details of either question, but I'll try, and then you can correct me if I haven't. On Obamacare, I was on the side of supporting Obamacare. It was a marginal, incremental improvement. We had 20 million uninsured before. We now have 10 million uninsured, despite Trump's efforts to eliminate it. So it's an improvement, but it never dealt with the problem of underinsurance, and it hasn't changed the structures or the dynamic of the American health system at all, which is precisely the reason why it passed. My last slide was going to show you the stability of the American system in spite of calls for reform since I entered graduate school. That's a long time. We've had incremental reforms, but the structures remain very much in place. The support, the system is supported by the insurance industry, the private insurance industry, which is very powerful, the American Medical Association, and the hospital industry. And those three stakeholders are sufficiently strong to keep the major contours of the system in place. So that, and I guess just to go back and try to integrate the end of your talk with the end of mine, the American healthcare system was, like the vaccines, strongly supported by public financing since the beginning. And the strategy in the United States after World War II on the supply side was to finance NIH, was to finance hospital modernization and construction, was to finance what we called manpower at that time, human resources, all through public funding and the federal government. At the same time, there's that big business, private ethic in the United States, which is very, very powerful. So it's really a public-private partnership. Recently, it has tilted a little bit more toward the private side with the growth of corporatization of medicine and of hospitals. Now, I'm not sure I understood your question, but I fully recognize that the Dutch system is unique, as is the Swiss system, and that all European systems are quite different. I was only characterizing, but I think if I understood you, you were saying that the insurance system is quite strong in Netherlands and has, no? Right.
And in the Netherlands, used to be a very much government rule system. Last 20 years, there was a strong power position of the insurance.
Right. So that. Right, and that's an argument for convergence. You're coming closer. That's what I was going to respond. So the insurance companies are much more powerful than they used to be, but all within the context of a statutory system where the government controls prices still. Are you not getting cancer medications? Are you? Right. I didn't know that. But one finds rationing of pharmaceuticals even in the United States. There are Mayo clinics in areas where new pharmaceuticals are not available, and it's a very complicated set of issues.
Yes, so from an innovation perspective, the US market is the most important market for new drug developments. This is where they first want to go to. That's why access to the US market is so important for any new drug, and patents are usually taken for the US market here. And actually, so we actually live a bit, we free ride a bit on the to be a bit perhaps a bit too provocative, but still we free ride a little bit on the high prices of the US here, because that's where the incentive is for firms to innovate. Once the US market is sufficiently covered and there is price segmentation possible, then they will also service the EU market here. But without the US market, a lot of products would not be innovated.
Question?
I noticed that Germany seems to be prevalent in your story. Is there a reason for that? And for the US story, you talked about corporates, corporations buying doctoral practices. And I wonder what were the business dynamics for that, because there's something that we don't see in Europe. So why would something as cheap as real estate, which is available for individuals and that is purchasable or rentable by a doctor, why would that be more efficient? Or efficient, why would the doctor choose salarized rather than be independent in the US system? Is there a particular reason for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the fact that Germany was in this mRNA story quite successful, BioNTech and CureVac, I think it's a bit of an exception for the mRNA and a bit of a lucky factor too. But in general, Germany does have also a strong biomedical science sector here. Of course, not as strong as the US and the UK, which are the strongholds here, but still it's very good here. But also in terms of development, because it also has these Fraunhofer institutes where science and then the link to development is more easily made. So these spin-off type of activities, like what CureVac did and what BioNTech did, is also a bit more established than in other continental European countries, not the UK. But in this case, it was really also simply because you have a few individuals that really saw the potential of mRNA and wanted to. It wasn't general at all here, and it wasn't also the big traditional German pharma companies that were on this here. So it was, again, a few individuals from a good functioning biomedical science system.
The trend to which I referred, and your question, I'll give you the figure on it, is something that's occurred over the last 10 years. 40%, roughly 43% now of physicians are working for hospitals in the United States. So why? First of all, to work as a physician alone in a private office was, at least over the last 20, 30 years, very difficult, because the private insurance companies are far more intrusive over medical practice than the public insurance in Europe. That is, there's much more review of what physicians are doing, much more questioning of what physicians are doing. Paradoxically, European physicians have more clinical autonomy than American physicians, although American physicians have far more income, and the trade-off is having more income and less clinical autonomy. Why? So it's become so difficult to practice because you're dealing with multiple insurers, filling out multiple forms. And there was a paper that came out suggesting that physicians spent 43 minutes a day just doing billing and filling out forms. That's not counting all their assistants to do it, but what they have to do themselves. So that kind of practice is highly intrusive. And once the hospital buys the practice, the hospital takes everything over, the physician gets the salary, and it becomes much easier in many ways. That's, I think, the reason. I'd like to make just one other point about the privatism in the American health system. That is, I'm often asked, why is there no national health insurance in the United States? Why is there no universal insurance? That's a long story, but it was decided by implicit policy, first beginning during World War II, when price and wage controls applied to all sectors, and the only way that employers could increase the salary, the social wage of their employees, was to extend health insurance benefits. Later in 1951, under Dwight Eisenhower, the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, had a very important change in policy, which allowed health insurance premiums for employers to be deductible from taxation. That's an implicit, not an explicit cost of government. If that was eliminated overnight, there would be $300 billion more in the hands of the US government. So that subsidy to the private health insurance industry is what has locked it in place. And all attempts to eliminate that subsidy are rejected.
Thank you. Maybe last short question.
At least this way, my family and I know that I'll be like savings out. Whereas with US healthcare at $1,600 a month, where you have to be totally unemployed and you have the perfect Obamacare. That's a big difference.
Yeah, the insecurity in the United States, in spite of Obamacare, is substantial. And Obamacare did not change that. And since Obamacare, prices continue to rise, premiums continue to rise. And what's happening is a privatization of Medicare, because my initial response will be, once you're 65, you have Medicare. But even Medicare is characterized by very high deductibles, not high deductibles, but high co-payments and no limits on the co-payments and the co-insurance, I would say. That's a big problem. Increasingly, Medicare is becoming privatized because 40% already of Medicare beneficiaries have chosen to have what's called Medicare Advantage, which are private HMOs or private managed care plans, which give you bigger benefits, but restrict, as Obamacare does, restrict your possibility of getting medical care to networks. And you never quite know who's in the network, who's not in the network, but you are far more circumscribed than in the European system. That's the paradox. And so you probably made a wise, depending on your income, you can still get extraordinarily good medical care and very good coverage as long as you buy the complementary insurance, but it's a highly inequitable system.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for this great presentation. Thank you for the nice question. I'm sure we can continue the discussion, but we will at the reception. And let me thank again Kenneth and then the Kurgan van Rendenrijk chair that made all this possible. Thank you.